Alright, here we go on the mice. Hey friends, what's going on? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yud Aleph, Daf 11 of Masechta Sukkah. Daf Yud Aleph, at the beginning, we of course continue with the discussion from yesterday. Shmuel's opinion regarding sleeping in the Sukkah inside of other things, like a kilas chasanim, which is like some kind of fort, tent thing inside of the Sukkah. So we will kind of wrap that up. Get to a new Mishnah which discusses schach, which is interesting, sort of the requirements for schach. And then we bring up, I think for the first time so far, if I'm not mistaken, the concept of taisa v'lo min ha'asui. That you have to make the right sukkah's taisa l'choshev hashem. You have to make for yourself a sukkah, not a sukkah that's already made, so to speak. You have to make it yourself. And we'll see nafkaminas and machlokas between Rav and Shmuel regarding the concept of tzitzasun zoi asyasun. If merely by cutting something, removing something from the ground, is that considered in asiyah in itself? We will get there a little bit later. Interesting sugya. And then at the end we get to the sugya of Lulav, tzarich, eged or not. Do you have to, the Lulav, the adas, maravos, do you have to bundle them up together into one unit? We'll see machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim there. So very interesting daf ahead of us. Let's get started on Daf Yud Aleph, Mud Aleph. Second line on the page. Lashon Acher, there's another way to understand Shmuel. Amri la, Amr Rav Yehuda, Amr Shmuel says, Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, Mutar lishan b'kilas chasanim b'sukkah, lefi she'ein lagag, af al pi shegavo asara. That says, Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, that you're allowed to sleep in a kilas chasanim in a sukkah, even though it doesn't have a roof, and even though because it doesn't have a roof, even though it's larger than 10 tefachim, higher than 10 tefachim, taller than 10 tefachim. What the heck is going on here? Remember yesterday, at the end of the daf, so Shmuel was talking about that you're allowed to sleep inside of your sukkah, even if you're on this bed that has a sheet kind of over it, and it's got a roof, so to speak, as long as it's 10 tefachim, as long as it's less than 10 tefachim, which is the minimum size of a sukkah, minimum height of a sukkah, as long as it's less than 10 tefachim, no problem. Even though it has a roof, no problem. As long as it's less than 10 tefachim, it's okay. You could sleep inside of that kila. So now, there's a different way to explain Shmuel, which is that he's not talking about a regular kila, which is like this bed that has a roof over it, but rather it's a kilas chasanim, which is similar, but it's more like the naklite amita. It's more like, it's got one pole at the feet and one pole at the head, and then a pole connecting them, so it's more like it comes to a point at the top, and it doesn't actually have a roof on it, more like a point. So now, let's read that again. Lashon acher amrila, so there's another way to say what Shmuel's statement, which is, Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel says, Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, mutar lishan b'chilas chasanim b'sukkah, you're allowed to sleep in this bed that has a sheet draped over it, that comes to a point at the top, as opposed to a roof at the top. Lefi she'ein lo gag, because it doesn't have a roof, it has a point. Af al pi shegavo asar, and that's even though it's 10 tefachim tall, still, because it comes to a point, you're allowed to sleep in it, in the sukkah, even if it's more than 10 tefachim tall. Okay. And it's not going to be an issue of you have to sleep in your sukkah, not inside a tent in your sukkah. Weiter. Where am I? Fine. Meister, we have a kasha. Hayashim b'chila b'sukkah lo yotzi dei chavasa. But one second, we have a kasha. Right? Shmuel just said that you're allowed to sleep in a kilas chasanim in the sukkah. Yeah, we have a brayse that says Hayashim b'chila b'sukkah, that a fellow who sleeps in a kila in a sukkah lo yotze de chavaso, he's not yotze. That's a brayse. It says he's not yotze. Hacham ma'askinim b'sheish lagag. Which the Gemara is quick to answer. Yeah, but that's talking about a regular kila. It's not talking about a kilas chasan. A regular kila has a roof. A kilas chasanim doesn't. It comes to a point. It's a different story. Apples and oranges. Tashma. Kamanir naklitin shnaim v'kinofis arba. So we have a brayse that says that naklite amita, is one at either end, i.e., when you drape the sheet over it, it's going to be just come to a point. V'kinofis arba, whereas these kinofis are bedposts. There are 4 of them, and if you spread a sheet over that, then you're going to have a roof. Peris agabe kinofis psula. If you spread a sheet over the kinofis which makes a roof, it's a problem, it's possible. If you spread out a sheet on top of naklitin, which makes like comes to a point, right, which makes like almost like a teepee, I don't know, not exactly a teepee, like a tent that comes to a point at the top, classic tent. Kshera. As long as the naklite amita are less than 10 or 10 tefachim or less, I don't know, is it 10 tefachim or less than 10 tefachim? Let's say less than 10 tefachim. As long as the naklite amita, this tent essentially that you're like building with these, poles at either end of the bed, as long as it's less than 10 tefachim, then it's beseder. But if the naklite amita are 10 tefachim above the bed, well then it's a problem. And even though it doesn't have a roof, it comes to a point, just like the kilas chasanim. And we're saying that if it's 10 tefachim, it's a problem. So how could Shmuel be saying that the kilas chasanim, which comes to a point, is kosher in a sukkah, even if it's taller than 10 tefachim? And yet, when it comes to naklite hamita, which seem to be the same thing, also like this tent that comes to a point, we say it's only acceptable up to 10 tefachim. Taller than that, it's a problem. Shiny naklitin de kviye. And for the Gemara, well, naklite amita are shtickle different than kilas chasanim. Naklite amita are kavua, they're fixed, whereas kilas chasanim is not kavua, and therefore that is why the naklite amita have to be within 10 tefachim, whereas the kilas chasanim, the Gemara wants to argue, can be even taller than 10 tefachim. Ikviye, but if the naklite amita are fixed, well then they have a kinofis. Well then they should be like the kinofis, which we said that even less than 10 tefachim are a problem. So and for the Gemara, ligabe kinofis lo kviye, that relative to kinofis, naklite amita would not be considered fixed and kavua and permanent. Ligabe kilo kviye, but relative to the kilas chasanim, they are considered fixed, because the kilas chasanim is like the least fixed that there is. Therefore, the kilas chasanim is allowed to be above 10 tefachim even, because it doesn't have a roof, it just kind of comes to a point, and it's not kavua at all. The naklite amita don't come to a point, and they're like more kavua than the kilas chasanim. So there you can sleep in it up to 10 tefachim. The kinofis, you can't even sleep less than 10 tefachim, because they're just pashut permanent. And they have a roof and all that stuff. Dorash Rabba Bar Rav Huna. Rabba Bar Rav Huna explained, Mutulisham b'chila, you're allowed to sleep in a kila, a regular kila, Hafalpisha yesh lagag, even though it has a roof. Hafalpisha gavoa asar, and even though it's 10 tefachim. Cheved, do you hear this? Let's read that again. Dorash Rabba Bar Rav Huna, Rabbi Bar Rav Huna explains, Mutar lisham be'kila, you're allowed to sleep in a kila in the sukkah, i.e., this like tent that has a roof on it. Afal pisha yesh lagag, even though it has a roof, afal pisha gavo asara, even though it's 10 tefachim tall. Big chiddush right here, big chiddush, chevre. Up until now, the most lenient we've seen has been Shmuel yesterday, who said that up until 10 tefachim you could sleep in it. But more than 10 tefachim, chevre, this is a big chiddush. Kiman ki Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, who's that like? It's like Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. The Amar, Rabbi Yehuda says, Lo asi ol arai u'mevatal ol kever. You hear that? That Rabbi Yehuda's principle is that a temporary ohel is not going to nullify a permanent ohel. And therefore, this kila that you have in the sukkah, this like little tent that you have above your bed, is a very temporary tent. And that's not going to be mevatal your sukkah, which is a permanent tent. We saw the other day that Rabbi Yehuda says that is one of the Tanaim who say that diras keva ba'inu, that we need the sukkah to be a permanent space. So he says that the temporary kila is not going to be mevatel the kavua, the permanent sukkah. Okay? The Tanan is we learn in the Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, says Rabbi Yehuda, Nohagna yinu lishon tachasamita b'fnei azkenim, that we would sleep underneath our beds in front of the zakenim, in front of the elders. So we see that according to Rabbi Yehuda, we slept underneath the beds, and even though the beds were creating an ohel, it was okay because And oil arai is not going to be mevatel on oil keva, which is exactly what we're saying here as well, which is what Rabbi Bar Funa is saying regarding the kila in the sukkah, that the oil arai will not be mevatel the oil keva. How come we need this statement by Rabbi Bar Funa to teach us that you're allowed to sleep in a kila inside of a sukkah, because it's like Rabbi Yehuda that in oil arai is not going to be mevatel in oil keva? Why not just say halachic Rabbi Yehuda? The halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, that in oil arai is not mevatel in oil keva. Why do I need this special statement of Rabbi Bar Funa and Amora to teach me what seems to be the same thing as Rabbi Yehuda's teaching? So just say the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. So, and for the Gemara, Amar halachic Rabbi Yehuda, if the Gemara would simply just say that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, have amina nemile mita, I might think that, yeah, specifically Rabbi Yehuda, in the context of sleeping underneath a bed, tilagaba asuya, that you're not supposed to sleep under a bed, you're supposed to sleep on top of a bed. Lamaisa, I do that. I sleep on top of a bed even. So usually. So I might think that according to Rabbi Yehuda, specifically when it comes to a bed, that you're supposed to sleep on top of it, and this nudnik sleeps underneath it, so maybe in that case we would say that the ohel arai, i.e. the bed, is not mevatel the ol keva, the sukkah. Aval kila de socha asuya, but a kila that you're supposed to sleep inside of it, and this fellow is sleeping inside of it, so emelo, I might think that that's not allowed, because you're using it properly, and it's sort of inside the tent, inside of your sukkah. I might think it's a problem. Kamash Milan time of Rabbi Yehuda, so also all arai mevatel ol keva. So Kamash Milan, that no, the point is that according to Rabbi Yehuda, in oil arai will not be mevatel on ol keva, whether you're sleeping underneath a bed, whether you're sleeping inside of a kila, it's not going to ruin the sukkah. Loshna mita v'loshna kila. Doesn't matter if it's sleeping underneath a bed, doesn't matter if it's sleeping in a kila, it's okay. And therefore, if you have a kila, even if it's 10 tfachim tall, it's okay, says Rabbi Bar Funa, because your ohel arai, i.e. your kila, will not be mevatel the ohel keva, which is your sukkah. Alright, exciting times, right? Yep. New Mishnah. Hidlo aleas agefen v'sadlas v'sakesum. If he sort of puts on the as schach a grapevine, a gourd vine, ivy, right? So you just kind of take you take a ivy, whatever, and then it's still connected to, let's say you have ivy growing on your house or something, and then you have your sukkah right next to your house. So if you just take like some ivy and then you just spread it over your sukkah, it's still connected to the ground, but you just spread it over your sukkah. V'sikech al gaba, and then you put schach on top of that, psula. It's a problem because the ivy is pasul schach because it's connected to the ground. Now, if there was a lot more kosher schach than there was ivy, let's say there was just like one vine of ivy, and the rest of the sukkah is kosher schach. So there's way more kosher schach than there is ivy. Or if you cut the ivy, so you spread the ivy over the sukkah, and it's still connected to the ground, but then you cut it afterwards. Kshera. So we say now it's no problem anymore, because it's no longer connected to the ground. So either you spread out the ivy, or the grapes, or the grapevines, or the gourd vines, you spread it over the sukkah. So it's a problem because it's still connected to the ground, but then you cut them. They're no longer connected to the ground. So kshera. Ze'aklal, this is the rule. Kol shu mekabel tumah. If you have something that is mekabel tumah, is able to receive tumah, ve'ein gidulo min haaretz, or it doesn't grow from the ground, ein misakhin bo. You can't use it as schach. Rashi gives an example. For example, hides. If you have animal hide, even if it's not fully processed, and therefore it's not mekabel tumah yet, but still it doesn't grow from the ground. You have to have something that grows from the ground and is not mekabel tumah, such as if you take I don't know, it's palm branches. Palm branches is a common schach in Eretz Yisrael. Palm branches, they grow from the ground, and they're not mekabel tumah, pshute kle'etz. So that would be a good inyan. Right? That if anything that is not makabel tumah and grows from the ground, that is kosher schach. Gewaldig. But if it's makabel tumah, so then it won't work. Alright, sounds good to me. Any questions? Let's go weiter. Yosef came to Rav Huna. So if Yosef was sitting before Rav Huna, which is cool, I feel like you don't see that too often. Yosef was a student of Rav Yehuda, who was contemporary of Rav Huna. Okay? Yosef came to Rav Huna. So if Yosef was sitting before Rav Huna, Yosef ka'amar, and Rav Yosef said, O shektatzon kshera. Okay. So we said that if you have like ivy, and you spread it over your sukkah, now it's still connected to the ground. So it's a problem. But, says the Mishnah, if you cut them from the ground, they're no longer connected to the ground, well now they're kosher. And Rav says, but that's not it. You can't just cut it and then magically it's good, right? Meaning, you can't cover your sukkah in pasol schach, in ivy that's still connected to the ground. And you have a kosher, you have a pasol sukkah, because the schach is pasol because it's connected to the ground. So then you push it, cut the ivy. It's no longer connected to the ground. Says Rav, that's not enough. That's not enough. It's still going to be pasol, even though you've cut it from the ground. Tzarich l'na'anea. You have to shake it. You have to like lift up each, what's it called? Each, vine. You have to lift up like each vine and put it back down. Right? It's not enough to separate it from the ground. You have to actually like pick them up and put them back down and do an asiyah. Right? We're going to see soon. Taisev lo mina asui. Right? That it says Chag Sukkah is taisev l'choshev asiyah. You have to make it, not for something that's already made in a psul. So therefore, when you take the ivy and you spread it out all over your sukkah, that's going to be your schach, and it's schach pasol. So it's been made improperly. It's been made in a pasol way. And even if you just cut the ivy, now it's no longer connected to the ground, but still it was made improperly. You now have to make it properly. And says Rav, v'tzarich l'na'anea. How do you make it properly? That once you disconnect the ivy or the grapevines or the gourd vines from the ground, you now have to pick up the vines and put them back down again, and now you're making it in a proper way. Omer Rav Huna, Hashmuel Amar. Now Rav Huna responds to Rav Yosef, and he says this wasn't the statement of Rav, this was the statement of Shmuel, that you have to like pick up the ivy and put it down. Drina Rav Yosef la'ape, Rav Yosef got upset. V'amar le, and he said to Rav Huna, Atu mika amino alach dilo amar Shmuel. Rav Yosef says to Rav Huna, he says, did I ever deny that? Did I ever say that Shmuel says that you don't need to lift it up and put it down? Amar Rav v'amar Shmuel. All I said is that Rav said it, but guess what? Rav said it and also Shmuel said it. Rav and Shmuel agree that you would have to lift up the vines and put them down again. Rav Huna responds to Rav Yosef and he says, actually, what I'm saying to you, Rav Yosef, is that the Shmuel Amar v'lo Rav. The Rav achshure machsher. So responds Rav Huna to Rav Yosef, he says, no, actually, what I'm saying is that it's specifically the opinion of Shmuel. Because Rav says that you would not need to pick up each vine and put it back down again. He would say that simply separating them from the ground is enough to deem them kosher. Because he's going to say the concept of tzitzoson zoi asyason. That, he's not going to argue with the concept of Chag HaSukkos taisev l'choshev asyam, it's a pasuk, right? Taisev lo mina asui. You have to make it properly. You can't just use something that was made already improperly. However, Rav is going to say, says Rav Huna, that according to Rab, that simply the activity of cutting these vines from the ground, that is the asiyah. The cutting, the disconnecting of the vine from the ground is the asiyah that is necessary, according to Rab. That by cutting and separating and disconnecting the vine from the ground, you are now making the sukkah in a kosher way. Whereas as Rav Huna, according to Shmuel, it's not enough. You would have to pick up each individual vine and put it back down on the sukkah in order for it to be considered that you made it in a kosher way. Like in the anecdote of Rav Amram Chasida, Rama Tchilta Lifarzoma de Anshe Beise, that Rav Amram Chasida, he made tzitzis for his wife. Now in general, women don't usually wear tzitzis, or often don't wear tzitzis, and that's because it's a mitzvah aseh shezman grama, or at least it's assumed that it's a mitzvah aseh shezman grama, that we don't wear tzitzis at night, and therefore it's a time-bound mitzvah, and women are paturas for mitzvah aseh shezman grama. However, Rav Amram Chasida felt that it's even, he held that tzitzis are even worn at night. It's even a mitzvah to wear tzitzis at night, and therefore it's always a mitzvah to wear tzitzis, in which case it's just a regular mitzvah saseh, not a mitzvah saseh shezman grama. And because it's a mitzvah saseh, so then his wife was also chayev to wear tzitzis, so therefore he made her some tzitzis. Tulan v'lo pasak rashi chutin shaloin. Now what he did was he tied the tzitzis. However, tzitzis, of course, are made up of 4 strings that you put through sort of the corner of the garment, and now you have 4 strings doubled over, so now it's 8 strings. However, he used one long string and just kind of like, put one through the hole and then kind of bent it and put it back through the hole and kind of zigzagged it through the corner. And it was really just one string. It wasn't 4 separate strings that were put through the corner. It was one long string. And he managed to tie the entire tzitzis like that, and only realized at the end, I didn't separate the string. I didn't cut it. So basically, the tzitzis are puzzle. So v'lo pasuk rashi chutin shelo, and he didn't cut the string to make them separate. Also, the comment of Chia bar Ashi, and then Rav Am Chasida came to Rav Chia bar Ashi, who was a student of Rav Amar Le, and he said to Rav Chia bar Ashi, Hachi Amar Rav, Amar Rav Chia bar Ashi said to Rav Am Chasida, Hachi Amar Rav, that this is what Rav said, Mafsukan vein ksherin, just cut them now, it's not too late. You can cut them now, even though the tzitzis are already made. So we see that Rav's opinion when it comes to tzitzis is that even after the fact, you can just cut the string and it's fine. And we see psikasun zoe asyasun, that cutting the strings is the making of the tzitzis, that even though you made them improperly with one long string, when you cut it, it's like you're now making the tzitzis properly. So Achanami also, when it comes to Sukkah, ktitzasun zoe asyasun, we'll say that Rav's opinion would be that by cutting the vines from the ground, that is the making of the sukkah properly. So even though you use these vines and you put them on the sukkah, and the sukkah is possible because the vines are connected to the ground, if you then cut the vines from the ground, that is considered the asiyah that you need. That's considered making the sukkah properly. Cutting the vines from the ground is the making of the sukkah in a kosher way. V'savar Shmuel lo aminu psikasun zoe asasun. Now, correct the Gemara 1 second, and Shmuel would disagree with that, meaning because we're assuming that Shmuel would say that it's not enough. Cutting the vines from the ground is not enough. It's a start. At this point now, the vines are no longer connected to the ground. You can use them for schach, but you would have to pick up each vine and put it back down. But veha Tani Shmuel mishum Reb Chia, but Shmuel taught the name of Reb Chia. Hita l'shnei kronos b'bas achas. If a fellow, similar to the story of Rav Am Chasida, if a fellow takes a string and he kind of puts it through 2 corners at once, so again, it's not set. He hasn't cut the string into 2. And then afterwards, he cut the string. We say it's kosher. So my lav shekosher v'chakach posek. And we want to assume that what this means, that what Shmuel is saying is that after he mamish ties the entire tzitzis, and he's got tzitzis made, he realizes that he still hasn't cut up the string, and he's saying that it's kosher even after the fact. Lo sheposek v'chakach kosher. No, it's talking about where he put the string into multiple corners at once, but then he cut the strings so that they would be separate individual strings, that before tying the actual tzitzis, and that's why it is kosher. But after the fact, Shmuel would not say that you'd simply be allowed to cut it. Fine. So my kosher. Kosher, my lememra. But what's the chiddush of that? Kilu, for Shmuel to say that he takes one long string, puts it through two corners at once, and then afterwards cuts it, and then only afterwards he ties the tzitzis, isn't it obvious that that would be kosher? So I might have the to say, I might think that, well, at the time that you make it into string, it has to be only one corner, and maybe that's a problem. Kamash when it's okay. Meaning if I just take one string and I put it through a corner, so I'm putting a kosher string through a corner. But if I take one long string and put it through two corners, and then I cut it in the middle, so what ends up happening is that the toch kedei, ki luboz manit, at the same exact time, right, that it becomes a kosher tzitzis thread, it's two corners, because you put it through two corners at once. We might need that at the time that it becomes a tzitzis thread, it's only in one corner, but over here it's through two corners. I might think that that's a problem. Kamash and Shmuel, no, that's okay. You could stick one long thread through multiple corners, cut them in the middle, and just at the same time you have multiple corners with the kosher threads, and that's okay. However, Shmuel would maintain that you would need to have the kosher strings before tying the tzitzis. If you tie the tzitzis and then afterwards you realize I didn't cut the strings, that's going to be a problem according to Shmuel. Whereas Rav would say, no, just cut them after the fact, and that's okay, because psikasan zoyas yasan, that the act of cutting the strings into multiple strings is considered the asiyah that you need, making the tzitzis. Whereas Shmuel says, no, psikasan lo zoyas yasan, that cutting the strings is not making the tzitzis. And then, of course, applying it back to our Mishnah with the Sukkah and the schach, if at the time that you put the schach or the ivy or the grapevines or the gourd vines on top of the Sukkah, if they're still connected to the ground, Rav would say no problem, just cut them, that's enough. That's considered asiyah, making a Sukkah. Shmuel says it's not enough, you'd have to first cut them as a prerequisite in order to make them kosher, but then you would have to pick up each one and put it down. That's the only way you'd have a proper making of the Sukkah in a kosher way. Meisvi, we have a kasha on Rav, Tloan v'lo posak, Rosh Echutin Sheloin Psulin. We have a brisa that says that if you made tzitzis, if you put strings on a four-cornered garment, v'lo pasak rosh echutin shelain, and you never cut the strings, meaning, so you took one long string, put it through a corner, right, and you tied tzitzis with long strings, but they weren't individual, right? You didn't have four individual strings divided, right, doubled over strings through each corner. You had one long string, and you tied the tzitzis like that, and then afterwards, and you never cut the string into individual strings. Psulin, you say it's possible. My love, psulin le'olam, v'tshuvta derab. So we want to say, yeah, it means that it's always possible. There's no way to fix it. If you had one long string and you tied the tzitzis when it was still one long string, you're going to have to undo the tzitzis and start over. Because you can't just cut it and make it kosher. So it's a kasha on Rav. Amalach Rav will respond to you, my psulin ad she'yipasku. Rav's going to answer, no, when it says that when you have one long string it's possible, it just means that it's possible until you cut it. But once you cut it, that's fine. Psikasan zoy asiyasa. Ushmuel Amar, where Shmuel would disagree and say, no, psulin la'olam. They are taka, possible forever. There's no way to fix it at this point. If you tie the tzitzis and you didn't cut the string into individual strings in advance, it's possible forever. You'd have to undo it and redo it. V'chein Amar Levi, similarly said Levi, psul la'olam, it's possible forever. V'chein Amar of Masna, Amar Shmuel, psul la'olam. And similarly says Rav Masna in the name of Shmuel that yes, these strings are pasul forever. If you didn't cut them in advance, pasul forever. We do not say psikasun zoyas yasun. Ikadam, those who say Amar of Masna, said of Masna, bedidi ava uvda, that taka, it once happened to me. The Rav Masna says the taka once happened to me that I made tzitzis and I didn't cut the string into individual strings in advance. And I came to Shmuel. And he said to me, Psun le'olam, they are pasul forever. So we see, okay, so Rav's kind of got like a uphill battle over here. He's saying that simply by cutting the tzitzis string or by cutting the schach, that's enough to be considered an asiyah. And yet when it comes to the tzitzis at least, you have Levi, Shmuel, Rav Masna, all saying that simply cutting the string after the fact is not enough to consider it like you made the tzitzis properly. Meisvei, we have another kasha on Rav. Tloin v'achakach posak rosh echutin sheloin. Psulin. How's Rav going to get out of that? That we have a brisa that Mamish says that if you tied tzitzis and then afterwards you cut the strings into individual strings, psulin. It's still pasul. What's Rav going to do with that? We have a brisa that seems to be explicitly saying that if after the fact you cut the strings, it's still pasul. Okay. And more so, Tanya Gabi Sukkah, we have a brisa when it comes to Sukkah, Taisa v'lo min ha'asui. Okay, as we've been saying, that the pasuk says, Chag HaSukkah is Taisa l'choshev hasyom, you have to make for yourself a Sukkah, Ta'aseh, you have to make it in a kosher way, in a proper way, v'lo min ha'asui, you can't just use a Sukkah that was made in a pasul way. No, you would have to make it in a kosher way. Mikan Amrum, from here they said, Hidla ales agefen, if you put on it grapevines, vesadlas, or gourd vines, vesakisum, or ivy, vesikech agabon, and you put schach on top of them, psula. It's pasul. Hey chidami, and what's this talking about with these vines? If we're talking about, well, they're still connected to the ground, he hasn't cut them, and we're saying you're not allowed to use them. Well, then what does this have to do with Taisa V'lomin Asui? The introduction to the brisa, the first part of the brisa was that we're about to give you, that we're talking about Taisa V'lomin Asui, and then we're talking about vines. Well, if they're still connected to the ground, what does that have to do with Taisa V'lomin Asui? Typically, the Mechubarininu say that the issue is because they're still connected to the ground. That's the problem. Rather, the point is that it must be talking about where he separated the ground, the vines from the ground. And what we're saying is, that even though you've separated these vines from the ground, it's still an issue of ta'aseh. You have to make a sukkah and not something that was made improperly. When you put these vines on the sukkah as schach, they were still connected to the ground. It was made bipsul, it was made improperly. And disconnecting the vines from the ground is not going to be enough to make it a kosher sukkah. Ta'aseh, you have to make it in a kosher way. You're going to have to pick up each vine and put it back down. It's not enough to simply separate the vines from the ground. V'katoni psula, we're saying it's pasul. V'shmamina d'lo amina k'titzasun zo'yas yasun u'tiyufta derab. So clearly then we see that we do not say k'titzasun zo'yas yasun. We do not say that by separating the vines from the ground, it's considered like you are making it in a proper way, in a kosher way. We're saying that even though you separate it from the ground, still it's a problem of Taisa V'lo Min Asui. So it's a kasha on Rav. Omer Loch Rav, to which Rav will respond to you, Hachab Mayaskinon, what is this brisa talking about? Dishalfinu shalufe, lo minkra asiya didu. Says Rav, no, that brisa, when it's saying that, if even when you separated these vines from the ground, it's still pasul. That's talking about where you kind of pulled them out of the ground. You didn't cut them in a way that it's clear that they're no longer connected to the ground. It's talking about where you kind of pulled them out of the ground and left them there where, unless you're looking carefully, it still looks like they're connected to the ground. So in that case, it wouldn't be enough to just pull them out of the ground. And it would still be pasul even when you pull them out of the ground. It's an issue of Taisa V'lo Min Asui. However, says Rav, if you would mamish cut them and it's clear that they're no longer connected to the ground, that would be a proper cutting, it would be k'tzitzason zoi asyason, and it would be considered like you are making the sukkah properly, and that would be acceptable, says Rav. Mikol makom. However, nonetheless, tzulan v'acharkach posa kasha l'Rav. But what about the first kasha? Okay, fine. So he deflected the kasha from the sukkah, and he says that the reason why, even after pulling it out of the ground, it's problems because you pulled it as opposed to cutting it. Fine, say that Rav agrees with that. That's okay. However, what about the brisa that says that if you have tzitzis and you mamish tie the tzitzis and then afterwards you cut the strings, it's possible? What does Rav do about that? He would say it's kosher because psikasan zoy asyasan. Cutting the strings is making the tzitzis properly. But the brisa seems to be saying that even if you cut it, it's still possible. Kasha. You say it's taka kasha on Rav. We don't know what to do with that. Now, interesting, it doesn't say tiyuvta l'Rav. It says kasha l'Rav. Possibly because it's Rav, and we see sometimes Rav Tana Upolik. Rav is sometimes considered a Tana. He can argue on brises. So maybe that's why we don't say, tiyuvta. It's like, a knockout. But rather kasha. It's a kasha. We don't know what to do with this. But, if need be, Rav can argue on that. I don't know, maybe. Speculating. So let's say that this is taka machlokas tanaim. This kasha of, do we say, k'tzitzason zoi asyason, that merely by cutting the vines and separating them from the ground, that's considered like you're making the sukkah in a kosher way. Let's say this is taka machlokas tanaim. Over v'likton, pasol divrib shim ben yotzadak v'chacham machshirin. What are we talking about? A hadas. Now our hadasim, I think that most of us probably get, they come in a package, they look perfect, no berries on them, everything is like in a row, mamish, they're like perfectly manufactured hadasim. I don't know how they do it. Somehow they do it. But if you look at a hadas tree, now in Achlaot, in Yerushalayim where I live, there are hadasim trees, if you look for them. So if you notice, there's actually berries on the trees, and the hadasim, they look kind of different to the hadasim that we use in our lulavs. Somehow they've perfected the hadasim making methods to make them perfect for our lulav kosher purposes. However, wild hadas trees, the leaves, we're gonna learn the halachas of hadasim in a few weeks. That they have to be 3 leaves coming out of the same spot. There's specific halachas of what makes a kosher hadas, and they've somehow figured out how to grow a hadas and that it's consistently kosher. But if you just look at a wild hadas, it looks different than the hadasim that we use. Now, there are often berries on hadasim. So the halacha is if there are more berries than there are leaves, it's a problem. But you can always just remove the berries. But on Yom Tif, we don't remove the berries. Because it's like fixing the hadas. We don't do that on Yom Tif. Now, over v'likton, says the Brisa, but what if a fellow did remove the berries on Yom Tif? Pasul. Divrei Reb Shimon ben Yotzadik. Reb Shimon ben Yotzadik says the hadas is pasul. Even if you remove the berries on Yom Tif, the hadas remains pasul, since there were more berries than leaves when Yom Tov started. V'chacham machshirin, the chacham say, no, lemaisa, you shouldn't remove the berries, but if you did, the fact of the matter is, if now there are more leaves than there are berries, it's a kosher hadas. So now we want to assume that everyone agrees right now that you have to bundle together your lulav, your hadasim, and your aravis. You have to bundle them all together. And making them the bundle is basically an asiyah. You're making it into a bundle. So if we say that you have to bundle together the lulav, the hadasim, and the aravos, so there's an asiyah, there's a making involved. V'afinu lulav misukah. And we're also going to make a second assumption, which is that everyone agrees that we learn out lulav from sukkah. Nothing fancy, just like by sukkah, dichsiv, it says by sukkah, dichsiv gabe sukkah, taisev lo min ha'asur, that by sukkah it says ta'aseh, you have to make the sukkah. You can't use it, a sukkah that was made in a pasul way and just use it. You'd have to make it in a kosher way. So we're going to say that the same thing applies to lulav. Why not say that? The same thing, right? As Rashi says, it's a binyan of a mamatzinu, just like we see by Sukkah, taisav and asui. Let's say the same thing by Lulav. So Lulav, tzarich, eged, you have to bundle together the Lulav, the adasim, and the ravos and make it, in that sense, make it into a Lulav bundle with the adasim and the ravos. And also, just like by Sukkah, taisav and asui, so we'll say the same thing by Lulav, and say that if you bundle together your Lulav, your adasim and your aravos, but at the time that you bundled together, the adasim had too many berries, and then after the fact, you remove the berries, the question is removing the berries going to be in asiyah? Is it going to be considered like you're making this Lulav bundle in a proper way now? So my so that's it. This is the machlokas between Reb Shimon ben Yotzadok and the Chachamim. Timan the machshir that the Chachamim will say that it's kosher. So Raminon gabi sukkah ktitzason zoi asiyason. So the Chachamim will say that by removing the berries, you now make the Lulav kosher. So they're going to say by a sukkah ktitzason zoi asiyason, that by merely cutting the vines from the ground, that's considered like you're now making the sukkah in a kosher way. And therefore, the Chacham will also say the same thing by Lulav, which is, by removing the berries, you're now making this Lulav bundle into a kosher bundle. So they'll agree like Rav, Uman de Pasil, and Reb Shimon ben Yotzadok, who says that even if you remove the berries, it's still Pasil. So he would say like Shmuel, which is that by Sukkah, we do not say that by separating the vines from the ground, it's not considered like you just constructed your Sukkah in a kosher way. And therefore, Reb Shimon ben Yotzadok would say the same thing by Lulav. Also by Lulav, we can also would say that by Lulav, Reb Shimon ben Yotzadok would hold that by removing the berries, that is not considered like you are making the Lulav in a kosher way. Okay? So therefore we want to say that the machlokas between Reb Shimon ben Yotzadok and the Chachamim is basically the same machlokas between Rav and Shmuel. Do we say ktitzason zoi asiyason, or in the case of the Lulav, likitason zoi asiyason, or don't we say that? We want to say that the Chachamim will say that if you remove the berries, it's now a kosher Lulav. So he's like Rav, who says that by cutting the vines from the ground, you now have a kosher sukkah. And Reb Shimon ben Yotzadok, who say that even if you remove the berries, it's still pasul. He holds like Shmuel, who says that you can't just cut the vines from the ground and say that now you have a kosher sukkah. Lo, the Gemara says, no, that's not the machlokas. It's not about ktitzas and zoi asyason, and it has nothing to do with the machlokas Rav and Shmuel. Both Reb Shimon ben Yotzadok and the Chachamim agree that when it comes to sukkah, we do not say ktitzason zoi asiyason. We do not say that you could just cut the vines from the ground and now you have a kosher sukkah. No way. However, the question is, do we in fact learn out lulav from sukkah? Meaning by sukkah, you can't just cut the things from, you can't just cut the vines from the ground and now have a kosher sukkah, that's for sure. But that's by sukkah. Do we actually learn out lulav from sukkah? If we learn out lulav from sukkah, fine. So that's like Reb Shimon ben Yotzadok. He'll say, look, just like you can't just cut the vines from the ground by sukkah, you also can't just remove the berries by lulav. But if you don't learn out lulav from sukkah, well then sure, by sukkah you can't just cut the vines from the ground, but that has no bearings on lulav. And therefore, the Chacham would say that we don't learn out lulav from sukkah, and whereas by sukkah you can't just cut the vines from the ground, by lulav you can remove the berries. Here the machlokas between Reb Shimon ben Yotzadok and the Chacham is whether or not you can learn out lulav. We learn out lulav from sukkah. Man de machshir, the Chachamim who say that it's kosher, sover lo yafinu lulav misukah. They say that we do not learn out lulav from sukkah, and therefore, even though by sukkah you cannot just remove the vines from the ground and say that it's kosher. However, by lulav, you can just remove the berries and now it's kosher. Uman de pasul, whereas Reb Shimon ben Yotzadok, who says that it's pasul, the lulav is possible. Savar yalfinan lulav misukah. He says that we do learn out lulav from sukkah. And just like by sukkah, you're not allowed to simply cut the vines and say you have a kosher sukkah now, you also cannot simply remove the berries from your hadas and say you have a kosher lulav. Or if you want, I'll give it a different explanation, which is lulav tzarich eged. If we in fact do hold that you have to bundle together your lulav, your adasim, and your aravis, so then kuli amalo pliged yafino lulav misukah, everyone would agree that we learn out lulav from sukkah, and that it would be a problem to remove the berries. However, however, the machlokas over here between Reb Shimon ben Yotzaddik is, and the Chacham is, do you actually have to bundle together your lulav, adasim, and aravos and actually make them into a lulav bundle? Reb Shimon ben Yotzaddik would say, yes, you have to make them into a lulav bundle, and therefore you need a proper asiyah. And if when you made them, it was, there were these berries, so you can't just remove them and say it's kosher. Whereas the Chacham say, look, you don't need to bundle together your lulav, your adasim, and your aravis. And therefore there's no asiyah. And because there's no asiyah that needs to be done, it's not like you made them in a possible way, and that by removing the berries, now all of a sudden, the question is, do you have to make them now in a kosher way? You didn't make anything in the first place, according to the Chacham. There's no chiyuv to bundle together the lulav, the adasim, and the aravis. And therefore, if your hadasim are simply have too many berries, so remove some berries, and now it's a kosher hadasim. That's it. We flip to Dani Tanoi, and it's like a machlokas Tanoim. The Tanya, as we learn in the Brisa, lulav ben agud ben she'eno agud kosher. That the Tanakama says that a lulav, whether it's bundled together, whether it is not bundled together, it's kosher. It doesn't have to be bundled together. The lulav, hadasim, the aravis. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, where it says Rabbi Yehuda, agud kosher she'eno agud pasul. Says Rabbi Yehuda, you have to bundle together the lulav, the adasim, and the aravis. They have to be bundled together into one unit. If you didn't bundle them together, it's pasul. My time with Rabbi Yehuda, how come Rabbi Yehuda says you have to bundle together the lulav? Because he learns out of Gzeir Shava. Rabbi Yehuda has a tradition of Gzeir Shava, that it says by the bundle of hyssop, by the Pesach Mitzrayim, by the Korban Pesach in Egypt, when they painted the blood onto the doorposts. So it says over there, it says there, and you will take a bundle of hyssop. It says by Lulav, and you will take for yourselves on the first day of Sukkot. Just like by the hyssop, by the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim, it was a bundle of hyssop. So you're also by the lulav, it's a bundle of the lulav. You take the lulav, adasim, the aravos, and you bundle them all together. Whereas the rabbis don't have that tradition of that Gzeir Shava. I don't know if I said Kavachom a minute ago, but I definitely meant Gzeir Shava. Right? It says Rashi in the Dibra Maskal Lo Yalfinan, he says Lolam Du. The rabbis don't learn that Gzeir Shava. Gzeir Shava. Vein Adam done Gzeir Shava me'atzmo. And you can't, I'm reading Rashi, you can't make up your own Gzeir Shavas. Ela imkein limdo me'rabo v'rabo me'rabo ad Moshe Rabbeinu. You have to have a tradition of a Gzeir Shava, of learning out this word from that word, from your teacher and his teacher, from his teacher, all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu. And maybe these two psukim of v'lekachtem agudas ezov and v'lekachtem lochem bayom harishon, maybe they're not to make some kind of teaching that, or just like over there it's a bundle, here it's a bundle. The rabbi said, look, we don't have that tradition, and therefore we can't learn out from them that it needs to be a bundle. Like, who does the following brisa go? Lulav mitzvah la'ogdo. A lulav, it's a mitzvah to bundle together the lulav, the adasim, and the aravis. Vim la'ogdo kosher. But if you didn't, it's still kosher. Rabbi Yehuda ki la'ogdo amai kosher. If it's Rabbi Yehuda, well, you have to make an eged. If you didn't make an eged, it's possible. So why does it say that a lulav you should make an eged, but if you didn't, it's still kosher? According to Rabbi Yehuda, it would be possible. Rabbanan amai mitzvah. But if it's the rabbis, why are you making a bundle in the first place? The rabbis say you don't have to. Why does it say that it's preferable to put it in a bundle? According to the rabbis, it has nothing to do with the bundle. The Olam Rabbanani Umishum shenemer zakeli b'aveu na lefanu b'mitzvahs. So answers the Gemara that really this brisa that says that it's a mitzvah to bundle together the lulav, the adasim, and the arabas, but if you didn't, it's kosher, it's the rabbis. And that's why if you didn't put it in the bundle, it's kosher. But why are we saying that it's a mitzvah to put together the lulav, the adasim, and the arabas? Because of zakeli maveu. The pasuk says that this is my God and I will glorify him. Hisnor lefanu b'mitzvahs, I will make beautiful mitzvahs. And therefore, even though the Chacham don't learn out the Gzeir Shava of L'kachtem, nonetheless, they say that a lulav looks nicer when you have the lulav, the adasim, the ravos all together. And therefore, for that reason, the Chacham would say we'd still advise you to bundle together the lulav, the adasim, the ravos, so that it looks beautiful. But if you didn't do it, it's not a mitzvah, it's not a chiyuv, they don't learn out the Gzeir Shava. That's the machlokus between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chacham. Rabbi Yehuda says that you have to bundle together the lulav, the adasim, and the ravos. The Chacham say it's nice, it looks better, but you don't have to do it. Okay, Cheved, that was daf Yud Aleph Masechta Sukkah. That was a real daf of Gemara, huh? The first part of the daf we explained Shmuel's opinion to say that if you have a kilas chasanim inside of your sukkah, right, a tent that comes to a point on top inside of your sukkah, you could sleep in that kilas chasanim, even if it's taller than 10 tefachim, because the kilas chasanim is pretty temporary, and therefore even if it's above 10 tefachim, it's fine. We saw the opinion of Rabbi Bar Hufuna that if you have these a regular kila, which is like it's got this like a roof on it, even if it's 10 tefachim tall, you could still sleep in it inside of your sukkah, because he holds like Rabbi Yehuda that an oil arai is not going to be mevatel an oil keva, and therefore even in a regular kila you could sleep in it in a sukkah even if it's taller than 10 tefachim. We then got to a new Mishnah which discusses what's considered kosher schach and what's considered pasul schach. In order for schach to be kosher, it has to have 3 criteria. It has to grow from the ground, it has to be disconnected from the ground, and it cannot be makabel tumah. You need those 3 factors. Then we got into the whole sugya of, well, what if when you used these vines, what if you use vines for schach, and at the time that you put them, you draped them over the sukkah as your schach, they were still connected to the ground, but afterwards you cut them. That was all you did. According to Rav, that's enough. That simply by cutting the vines from the ground, that is the asiyah, that's the making, as it says, make for yourself a sukkah. By cutting, when it's still connected to the ground, it's a pasul sukkah, but by cutting it, that's what you're doing to now make it into a kosher sukkah. Shmuel says that's not enough to simply cut it. You would have to actually pick up the vines and put them back down, and by putting them back down, that is the making of the sukkah properly. And along the way, we kind of saw the same machlokus in the context of tzitzis, that if you use one long string, entire tzitzis that way, and then only cut it into individual strings after they've already been tied, Rav would say it's okay, that by cutting the string into multiple strings, that is making the tzitzis properly. Shmuel would say, no, you can't just cut them after the fact, and they would be pasul. And at the end of the Gemara, we got into the machlokes of lulav tzarich eged or lulav eino tzarich eged. Do you have to bundle together the lulav, the adasim, and the aravis? The Chacham say, no, you don't have to. But we saw at the end that it's preferable because it looks beautiful that way to take the lulav, adasim, and the aravis all together. So it's preferable to bundle them together, but you don't have to. Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is that it's a chiyuv. He learns out Gzeir Shava l'kachtem that it says by the hisip, by the Pesach Mitzrayim, the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim, that you would take a bundle of hyssop. So also by the lulav, you have to take a bundle and bundle together the lulav, adasim, and the aravis. Okay, very nice. That was daf Yud Aleph of Masechta Sukkah. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day. Cheers.